So, good afternoon. I'm Nick Fry. I'm the curator of the John W. Barriger III National Railroad Library at the University of Missouri St. Louis. I'd like to thank everybody for attending and joining us today. And just to allow us to get the best quality of recording, I'm going to mute everybody's mic. As presenters come online, they'll get unmuted. But again, please use the chat function to ask your questions. Okay. This is our first Barriger online seminar on the Monon Railroad, the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville. This was one of the 4 railroads that John W. Barriger III was a president of during his professional career in the railroad industry. The idea for this event is born out of COVID, and our board president, who is on this presentation, Stefan Loeb, who called me one day and said we should look at doing something like this, and having also experienced similar events with other railroad historical groups, this was a great idea, and hopefully this is going to be enough of a success that we get to keep doing this. So we've got 3 presentations today. They're all going to run about an hour each. The first one is going to be on Mr. Barriger and his time on the Monon. It's only going to be an hour for someone who spent almost 7 years on the property, and I can't hope to do it justice, but it's going to be a nice overview. And if you're intellectually curious afterwards, there are plenty of resources we can point you to. Next up, Kevin Rubla from Caboose Hobbies, and currently in the Mountain Time Zone, will be talking about his experiences growing up with the Monon Railroad. And then Kevin will be leading an employee roundtable for our last hour. We're leaving that to the end because these things always tend to go over. And I didn't announce it to everyone, but I do have this set up for 6 hours. But I'm sure we all have dinner we'd like to eat sometime today. So we'll try and keep it reasonable. And one thing I'd like to do before I start the presentation, this is our first event since Jack Barriger passed away this November, the week before Thanksgiving. And we wanted to dedicate this event to him. This is a shot of him and Evie at the National Railroad Hall of Fame in Galesburg, Illinois, in June of 2012. Which was the induction ceremony for John W. Barriger III into the National Railroad Hall of Fame. And one of the first trips I got to take as curator of the Barriger Library with my board. So it was a memorable weekend, and I'm sorry Jack didn't get to join us today in person. I'm sure he's with us in spirit to enjoy talking about one of his father's railroads. So we'll go ahead and get started. If the Barriger Library is going to do an event and I get asked to do a presentation, I'm going to do a shameless plug of some kind of presentation that brings the library's resources, collections, and usefulness into our talk. So we're going to talk about John W. Barriger III and his time on the Monon Railway. This was his first railroad presidency. He called the railroad the guinea pig railroad, where he tried out many of his ideas that he believed about super railroading, even though the Monon's right-of-way was not really conducive to creating a true super railroad that Barriger was envisioning in a larger scale. He was able to start looking at and implementing some of the ideas that he was proposing and trying them out. So it's an interesting set piece to examine in his career. And you can look at things he tried on the Monon and then examine how it passed. Those ideas either worked or didn't work, and how they continued into future jobs that he had within the industry. Barriger came onto the Monon in 1946. The railroad was just shy of 100 years old. It had been constructed in the 1840s railroad boom and grown over time until it basically was a pair of main lines. That one went from Chicago to Indianapolis, and another went from Michigan City, Indiana to Louisville. And they met at Monon. Total track mileage was 552 miles. It had 2,000 employees. And by 1946, it had been under receivership for 12 years. It had not handled financial panics well over time, and changes in technology after World War I were also pretty detrimental to the bottom line of the Monon. It was not a long railroad, and as trucking technology and road surface technology and road surface conditions in Indiana improved, the Monon saw trucks start to eat into its traffic, and it became a vicious cycle of deferred maintenance, traffic declines, deferred maintenance, more traffic declines, to the point that Monon became something of a joke in the state of Indiana. Business Week in 1947 called the Monon the Hoosier Headache. There was the folk song, Ireland Must Be Heaven because the Monon don't go there. It was rough. It was not a railroad that also was, in addition to the fact that it was in receivership, it was not a railroad that controlled its own destiny. It hadn't for years because it was currently 50% owned by the L&N and 50% owned by the Southern. And they had not been investing in the property. Finally, after World War II, which had injected some funds and some financial benefit into the company, 12 years of receivership, the parties that held securities on the railroad finally basically said, okay, we're going into bankruptcy, we're going to reorganize this company, and this really has to change. Those three properties were Robert Young's interest, and this is the same Robert Young who would wind up buying the New York Central in exchange for the C&O, New York Life Insurance, and Chase National Bank. And they're the ones who brought Barriger in. Barriger at this time was at Fairbanks Morse, and he had wrapped up most of his wartime service with the federal government. He had started in working on railroad financial matters when he left the Pennsy and went to Kuhn Loeb and Company in 1929 in what he and Jack would say was one of the worst timed job moves in his career, to leave the security of the Pennsylvania Railroad to go to Wall Street right before the crash. But that got him on radars of people who would help him out throughout his time in the industry. It got him to the attention of Frederick Prince. Frederick Prince was a gentleman who was working on a railroad consolidation proposal, and Barriger got working on that. That brought him in contact with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and the Roosevelt administration, and that got him in contact with a lot of people in the industry, and not just railroad operating people, but also financial people. And they're the group that chose Barriger to take over the Monon. Let me go. There we go. The Monon itself was in rough shape. It had a lot of old equipment. In 1946, it had 84 steam locomotives, the newest of which was from 1928. It had 4 diesel switch engines that they'd acquired during World War II. They had over 3,200 freight cars, of which almost 1,500 were in bad order. or hopelessly obsolete to be cost effective. It was bleeding cash still. 1946. Now, this is the end of year numbers that I pulled from the railroad statistics of the United States. So this includes Barriger's partial first year as president. They had $11.5 million of operating revenue and about $10.2 million of operating expenses for a net of about $1.2 million in overall operating revenue over expenses. In Hunter Harrison world, that's an OR of 89.58, which is not where you want to be. Barriger's job is to fix that, to get that number down, to get the net income up. That number is just the operating income. That's not including the net income after fixed expenses. And that number goes way down when you add in securities interest, rent, insurance costs, overhead that's not related to operating. That makes things really, really rough for this little railroad. The property really had seen better days, although it had a selection of robust stone, Indiana limestone buildings, like the station at the famous crossing of Monon, Indiana. It needed a lot of work. Traffic was generally coal and commodity based. Shippers were dissatisfied with the slow movement of freights on the railroad, and they would switch to trucks or other competing railroads over time. And as such, Monon got either traffic that was captive to it or traffic that nobody else wanted. Just gratuitous mining pictures here at this point. I had really a lot of fun putting the PowerPoint together. This is a branch line, but I used it as a good example of what a lot of the right-of-way was looking like before Barriger came in. Bad ties, bad ballast, everything slow. It's everything that would slow a railroad down in terms of physical plan. Facilities that were in dire need of modernization, and a traffic base that needed diversification. So Barriger shows up. First, he shows up in February of 46 as one of the three managers. And in May, the ownership group says, let's go ahead and make you the president. And they start pouring money into the company. $26 million got put in for the first year. And Barriger also brought in management hands that he knew or had worked with before with other companies or folks from the railroad that he saw, that he had met, that could run the company. Barriger was the president, but he also was the traveling freight agent. And I was talking to Kevin about this at a Caboose online event on last week. Barriger does not tend to get into the engineering nuts and bolts of the technology side of the company. He understands that diesels work. He understands that diesels are much more cost effective at moving trains than the steam locomotives. He does have strong opinions about Fairbanks Morse because of his experience working there. And you would note that most of Monon's diesels that were bought were not Fairbanks Morse. He also had strong opinions about Baldwin's designs. There were no Baldwins bought for the Monon when Barriger was president. There were a couple of Fairbanks Morse, but part of that was there were no, post-World War II, everybody's buying diesels, and if you want locomotives, you're going to have to split up your order amongst different suppliers. So Alco, GM, and Fairbanks Morse were the big suppliers, but Baldwin got left out. But this investment was not just in locomotives. He knew he needed to get new freight cars. He knew he needed to invest in the physical plant. Part of the Monon's problem is there is a sawtooth or hogback aspect to parts of the main line that is operationally expensive, that would need to be fixed. There were bridges that were in extremely rough shape from a safety standpoint that needed to be dealt with, or just outright avoided. So in his first year, he starts doing that. The last locomotive, the last steam locomotive in 1947. Barriger's getting rid of these things as quickly as he can. And what I found interesting, you can't be a curator of the Barriger Library without being a rail fan. And you know, there's the very pro steam camp and there's the not pro steam camp. And the very pro steam camp always tends to have a dim view of railroad presidents that got rid of the steam locomotives. And it's a passion thing, and I understand that. I've never really heard that kind of pushback from folks who missed or enjoyed Monon steam in any recollections, even from the employees. Part of that is Barriger made a point to make sure employees who had been mechanics on steam locomotives were trained to be mechanics on the diesels. He did not want to alienate his skilled workforce and the unions with the technology change. And from a business standpoint, avoiding a union situation makes sense, but it also makes sense to keep your veterans around who know the railroad. And in fact, one of the articles talking about Barriger's conscious decision to retrain the steam workforce to be a diesel workforce, talked about how it was a humanization of the business, which was a good PR coup. And it's one other thing that Barriger was very good at is the PR aspect of being a railroad president. His job is to sell the Monon. And if he's fighting union strikes, that's not going to help him sell the Monon. So his first year plus takes us up to 1947. We've got diesels on the property now. 33 showed up on the property in 1947. They did lose 3 to accidents. There were 46 steam locomotives on the property, and 29 were retired. They did buy 1. I have to look up exactly why they bought that. And in his first year, he took revenues from 11 million to 15.5 million. Expenses went up to almost 13 million, but his net operating revenue was now 2 million, almost $800,000. His OR had dropped 7 points to 82.21. So everything's looking like it's going in the right direction. And that is exactly what his ownership wants to see. His freight car count goes up from 1,911 to 2,286 by the end of the calendar year. And he's improving business. He's going to customers. He's touting the fact that, we're running a much more reliable railroad. For those of you who are BL2 fans, there's the gratuitous BL2 shot. Also one of my favorite pictures in the collection. And Barriger's running around the property. He's taking people on the business car. He's trying to get new business. He took all of his freight agents out on the property. That was one of the first things he did. He had 14 freight agents that had, in many cases, not been on the property for 20 years. They had no idea what the capabilities were. They had no idea how bad things were. They had no idea what the potential was going to be for the company. And this was an eye-opening tour for them And also they got to hear from the boss what is the objective for the company. You know, everything is going to get modern. I mean, you're still seeing here wood-sided gondolas. Now, granted, hopefully that's in work train service, but with the Monon at this point, there's no guarantee that's going to happen. That's the case. They did get some new equipment in World War II. Barriger makes the most of that. He also utilizes some of his experience with the Office of Defense Transportation and government service in realizing that there is equipment out there that he can get for his railroad that will improve things. He also realizes he's got a gem in that his railroad goes to French Lick, which gives him a really nice place to entertain and market the railroad to shippers, work with Indiana political officials, and showcase the company by the service they can provide, just getting from, say, Indianapolis to French Lick, or Chicago to French Lick, or Louisville to French Lick. So he's pushing hard for all of that. He's also helped by the fact that 1947 is the centennial year for the Monon. And they decide they're going to have themselves a big old birthday party. Again, this is a great marketing tactic. It allows work to be done to repair the image of the Monon and the reputation of the Monon with all of the communities that it serves. You know, if we think about complaints now about railroad crossings being blocked, that was not a new thing for the Monon. The other thing Barriger really was trying to deal with from an operational aspect, Indiana had a full crew law. Monon trains were under 70 cars long so that they didn't have to add another crew member. So Barriger goes around with his team of marketing and traffic and officials and stumps the Monon. It's almost like a political campaign, the 1947 centennial year. They borrow the William Mason from the B&O Railroad and use that as an part of an exhibition train for the big centennial party. I should also note, and I feel honor bound to admit it, I am a B&O guy, so there is the occasional bias towards the company that shows up in all my talks. And then Jack, this is one of this picture made it into the biography that Roger Grant did, and it's one of Jack's pictures mentioned it to me. That's Jack Barriger. They had a Bells of the Monon. Each community along the Monon had a beauty contest, and the winners were proclaimed Bells of the Monon. They were part of the promotional tour. And Jack and his sisters are both in this picture. And Jack was at the big centennial party with the whole family. His brother Stanley and his sisters Betty and Ann were there. And Jack was a belle of the Monon. You'll notice that they had things like Miss New Albany, Miss Indianapolis, and Jack was Miss Take. That was, Jack actually asked me to find that picture one time for him. I think it was when they were working on the biography of his dad. And it winds up in the book, but that was a fun picture to find. And another great shot, they fully utilized the French Lick service. And in fact, Barriger tried to expand it because it was a jewel of the Monon's potential to get the business traveler on a weekend to go to French Lick to gamble and relax. The genteel gambling that was going on there that had started those resorts. Long term, this is not going to pan out for Barriger's time on the railroad, but it was a valiant effort to really kind of what railroads we're trying to do what airlines do with, say, Admiral's Club. Really promote the high level business aspect and cater to that decision maker market for traffic. He also worked with Raymond Loewy on designing a new logo for the railroad, which is the M with the arrowhead, which we see on this company bus, also in French Lick. And when I mentioned his government service, he realized how much equipment the government had bought for World War II that it wasn't going to need afterwards. And one of those pieces were hospital trains that the Army bought. Once hostilities ended, that was all excess equipment, and it was at fire sale prices. And Barriger needed newer passenger equipment than what he had. He had old, heavyweight Pullman style, either Pullman built or ACF built cars that were not helpful to the speed and operating efficiency of the railroad. So he was able to buy Army hospital cars, surplus, that had been built. I think these were all built by AC&F, and converted them into passenger train sets. And there was, of course, a big marketing push to kind of help with the new look of the Monon, the new modern look of the Monon. This is from the christening ceremony of the new trains. We had the Hoosier, and what was the other one? Was it the Thoroughbred, I think? Which was, and they were designed to go somewhere out of Chicago to Indianapolis. They had trains to Louisville, and they were making a push for passenger traffic. Barriger was not opposed to passenger trains so long as they paid their way. If they made money, his idea was great. Let's run them because they help the overall operating ratio by paying their share or a portion of the cost of maintaining the right of way and the facilities. So if they're making money, keep running them. And he tried. Now, unfortunately, during his time, passenger traffic on the Monon wound up declining 20%, and the passenger trains that he instituted wound up losing about $85,000 a year, which is not good, especially for a company that was in as rough shape as the Monon was. But nationally, traffic numbers had declined 47%. So Barriger's decision to market to the traveler going to places like French Lick. He tried the college market, which I know Amtrak is always big in trying to get college students as customers. They had the Varsity, which was the train that served the universities and colleges along the Monon route, so that the kids, if they wanted to go to Chicago for the weekend, could go. Or if they were living in Chicago or needed to connect with trains to go home through Chicago. That was his mindset. Get them on the Monon. Maybe they'll stay for, if we get 4 years worth of customers out of them, that's so much the better. Also, these cars had a very distinct, very flat tail end on the observation car. This is the Hoosier on train, this is train 15 in August of 48. This is also from the Barriger scrapbook. I think this is Monon, Indiana as well. Another better view of the whole train set with the two EMD diesels that had arrived on the property in 47, the F3s, and that nice Indiana University themed paint scheme that worked out real well. And Barriger is constantly going around and speaking at traffic clubs. He's getting investment to replace bridges. And the this should be Cedar Lake, but it is mislabeled Cedar Rapids. They built the Cedar Lake cutoff to avoid a very unfortunate engineering situation with grades and a bridge. And this is the kind of railroad that Barriger wants. You know, clean, modern, well-maintained, robust. Because he wants to run a lot of freight trains over. He wants to run as many freight trains as he can on the property. Because he's trying to make as much business for the property as he can. The steam shops, of course, got modernized to serve the diesels. He was not above, I will say, I am 90% sure this is an after development edit to the photograph, because this is just way too clean compared to the rest of the car. So I'm pretty sure you never saw this in real life on the property, but he's got no problem with marketing for a big shipper. None at all. And he's also has no problem working as as a carrier of bridge traffic. It's revenue, it's income. He would like the traffic to be originating and terminating on the Monon, but black ink is black ink. If he takes business from Chicago to Louisville, fine, that he's happy with that. Iron ore traffic, 35-mile-per-hour speed limit, but it's significant revenue, taking that to, I think this went into a customer in Kentucky at the end of the trip. But this is coming out of, this is the DM&IR. You know, this is a heavy train, but it's heavy revenue for him. And he's no problem with taking that kind of business. And he's rebuilt the Monon that it's safe and reliable to handle that kind of load. Michigan City, Indiana, deliveries from Pullman. These are brand new Navy boxcars that are going into service. So the freights are running on time. They've added freight traffic. He's got the freights running on a schedule, which was unusual for the Monon. The mindset was, if the freight train is going to run on a schedule, even if it's just the locomotive and a caboose, but it's going to run on a schedule and it's going to keep the schedule, because that's how we keep the shippers. That's how we get the shippers, and that's how we keep them. I didn't realize who had taken this. Chuck Hoppy was on the board when I started on the library as curator, and I didn't realize he had taken pictures on a cab ride and sent them to Mr. Barriger. This is 1950, and we've got train 6 and train 5 meeting each other, and Chuck's in the cab on number 5. In June of 1950, he's got his camera with him. He took a sequence of shots on that trip and gave them to Mr. Barriger. But the work he was doing is attracting. Chuck winds up working in the industry basically in DC for most of his time. But he's attracting attention for his methods and his results in turning around the Monon. He's bringing in Boy Scout troops. He's bringing in the community. You get community support that makes things easier if you have to cut trains, if you have to inconvenience communities by construction projects. If they appreciate what you're doing for them, you're going to be able to do what you need to do without a lot of pushback in individual communities. And the Monon goes from being an Indiana joke to fastest dang train I ever saw. Barriger turns the company around. He does a very nice job between 1946 and 1952 in really repairing the Monon to a point that it was not 2 steps away from disappearing. But he realized the Monon on its own could not survive. It just was not going to be long-term economically viable as an independent railroad. And he was seeking mergers towards the end. He had done pretty much everything he could do to fix the company on his own through the trustees. Anything else was going to have to come from a larger partner. He would have preferred L&N or CNEI taking over the company. When he went to P&LE, he wound up suggesting that to Al Perlman that P&LE or that New York Central look at buying the Monon to strengthen north-south connections. He just couldn't get a lot of traction on that, partially because he's about 30 years ahead of time for regulatory acceptance of that, and he's about 10 to 15 years ahead of time for the industry to really embrace it without, and still accept the fact that the ICC is going to make it just a real painful process. But it was a, you know, he knew what was happening. When he realized that there wasn't any more he could do, he started looking at where else can I go now? Where's the next job? He knew Bucky Dumaine, who was associated with the New Haven, Bucky Dumaine Jr. And so Barriger decides he's going to go and become what was going to be co-president of the New Haven with Dumaine. I've seen it reported as vice president, but according to Jack, the arrangement was going to be that they were both Barriger and Dumaine were going to be co-presidents of the railroad. Long-term, that is not sustainable when you've got two people in charge at the same time who aren't necessarily on the same page. But Barriger saw the New Haven as another example of where he could really work to implement his super railroad ideas that he'd experimented with on the Monon, and then continue on and see what else he can do with another railroad that, in terms of infrastructure, had some really interesting potential for his ideas. This is, I always like to put my sources. Monon Route by Hilton, I'm sure most people have this in their own personal libraries. It's the definitive company in the history of the Monon. John W. Barriger Railroad Legend is the definitive history of Mr. Barriger. Roger Grant wrote that now 3 years ago. And if you've been following us digitally at the library through our Flickr site, flickr.com/Barriger Library, you know we've got several hundred Monon photographs that Mr. Barriger took. Every one that I used in today's presentation either came from that site or has been uploaded from that site. This was from 2 of the scrapbooks in Mr. Barriger's collection. One thing to note, John Barriger, he always took his camera with him when he went out on the property. And the really nice thing about being the president of the railroad, when you have your camera with them, nobody tells you you can't take pictures here. So we have a lot of great pictures of railroads he was involved with. And the Monon has some really, really nice stuff that I hope you all will enjoy. And also, we took advantage of our collection of the annual report on statistics of the railways of the United States. The numbers really tell the story of the improvement of the health of the Monon. It's not exciting, but in black and white, that tells you how the company improved during his tenure. And we have pretty much a complete run of that periodical at the library, and we scanned and put online, thanks to the Association of American Railroads making a donation for the project, basically the post-World War II into the mid-60s era. And we're going to push that out into the 70s. So that is actually accessible through the library's website for anyone who wants to keep researching. And of course, Mr. Barriger's own collection is significant in its Monon holdings. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm going to start scrolling through the chat here and see if anyone has any questions. Dave Hammer had a question about did any steam survive, or did they mostly end up scrapped? There is one at Thief River Falls, Minnesota, that Kevin pointed out. Some went to the Sioux, but it was the steam power was very much worn out by the time Barriger had gotten there, and unlike other larger, well-financed railroads that rebuilt steam to buy time for their diesel orders to get filled, Monon just didn't have, one, that kind of money, and they didn't have that kind of time to do that. So they literally ran them until they fell apart, essentially. Let's see. Thank you again for your time. And if there's no other questions here in chat, I would thank you. And we'll take a couple of minutes. I'm going to switch over to Kevin so that he can get his presentation ready to go. And we'll be set.